Streaming and recording. Is that all?
I believe that's all you have to do, yeah.
Okay, awesome. Oh, someone's there. All right. So, this workshop is about elegance and sophistication in game design. Before I even start, does anyone have any idea what that might entail? Anyone? All right. Oh,
I know, it's the opposite of D&D 3.5.
Yeah. I'm not gonna argue. Okay, well, let's get started. What does it mean for something to be elegant to begin with? Does anyone know what that word means?
It's like, I guess the opposite of clumsy.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's like effortless, but it's still like done well.
Yeah. That's a good way of putting it. Something that or at least it appears effortless, but it is done well. Yeah.
Or it takes an action without wasted energy.
Say that again.
Takes an action without wasted energy.
Yeah. I think when you look at all that, it kind of has that low input, high output kind of vibe. And that's kind of what we get when we look at elegant things. Like if you look at ice skating is often considered to be an elegant thing if done well. But all it is kind of like walking on ice with a specific type of movement that makes you look very graceful and elegant. But there's not a lot going on. It's just moving through ice. But the way that is done, it conveys a lot because it's actually very hard to do, especially if you look at like figure skaters. Like that's insane, but all they're really doing is moving through ice in fancy ways. So it's an elegant art form. People say that's like, elegance is often a lot of times associated with swans. And I think swans are also kind of like that because they're just basically a big white duck. But they look nice, right? Elegant things do a lot with very little. So low input, high output kind of a thing is just take a duck, make it bigger, make it white, but it looks cool. There's an elegance to that. It's very hard to make something elegant. Because you're working with a very limited tool set inherently, because you have to put very little things and make them feel like a lot to the player, not look like a lot, but feel like there's a lot to it, because there is a lot to it, and I'll get to that. And I say easy to grasp. I think that is also important because it's not just about being easy to create or like being simple in its construction. I mean, it's also it's easy to understand something that is elegant, right? Like you look at ice skating and like how it's done well, it's like it's beyond me, but like just the base act of doing it makes sense. You're skating through ice. It's impressive. It's admirable. To us humans, our brains like that because it feels like a net gain and it's cool and nice and it's not cluttered. It's not too much for the brain to do. If you look at non-elegant things, a lot of times they're very clumsy and there's a lot going on, and you like look at a building that has like tons of shit and the architecture is very complicated and weird, and that is cool in its own right, but like your brain is like, what is happening? Yeah, does that make sense? I guess. Okay. That is design in general, but let's bring it up to the game design. What does that mean for games? Does anyone have a guess, Timon? Of, given what we just talked about, elegance, right? Doing a lot with very little. What is a way a game does that?
Like expanding on a single mechanic.
Yep.
A game that can convey a lot of information in a simple UI.
Yep. Those two are big ones.
Mechanic that flows really intuitively between different like activities.
Yes. Yeah.
Can I give an example of a game that I think?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Portal.
Yeah.
The only mechanic is you shoot portals, but like what they do with that and how much more there is to just that one mechanic.
Right. That is actually the premier example that I'm going to use in future slides. But yeah, Portal is a very elegant game. Portal is something that, like, to bring it back to like the core of elegance, right? Just running and shooting portals, whatever. Like the rules are, if you run, you can shoot 2 portals. What goes into one portal comes out the other portal. Done. Right. Also, there are physics. That's a mechanic, but or a set of mechanics. But that's simple. That's easy to look at and kind of understand what that is. It's even easy to get started with it. But when you look at crazy, like the higher level portal puzzles and the crazy shit that people do, it like, you have to start thinking in a different way. It's very deep. It's like you have to get right in there, and it's like there's a lot going on, but like with a very limited tool set. So yeah, and the 2 biggest ways that comes across is in the 2 first things that were brought up. Doing a lot with a mechanic. And a lot of times that isn't just one mechanic. Take Mario, run and jump, does a whole lot with just those 2 things. And of course there are other mechanics, but the core of it is built around that. And that's a lot of what elegance is building around a small set of things. And another way that comes across is UI, user interface. If you play a game that is not elegant, you will look at the screen and there are like buttons everywhere and things to click, and you're like, where do I start? You know, like you just don't know, and there's a high barrier of entry where you're like, it takes a lot of effort to get past that wall of like, there are a lot of things in the screen right now and I'm overwhelmed. With simpler games like Portal, like Mario, there's a lot that you can do with it, yes, but what is a UI? It's like just what is happening in the game. There aren't like a billion like options to choose from. It's just the game. That is to say, and we're going to get more into that later, that is to say that complexity can't be, that is not to say that complexity can't be good. It can, and that is the sophistication part of the elegance versus sophistication. But let's keep talking about elegance. And you guys, who was here for last week's? Okay, yeah. Oops. So last week we talked about MDA. Can anyone tell me what MDA is real quick? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a framework for game development. It goes mechanics first, dynamics second, and then aesthetics third.
Yes. Mechanics, dynamics, aesthetics. Very useful. It's been a huge part of every game design that I do. Every game design? Every time I just work on designing. Okay, what does mechanics mean? Yeah.
The simple things that a player can do.
Yes.
The way that the player interacts with the game.
Right, the rules of the game. The lines that are written in the rule book for a board game, the lines of code in your thing. Okay, dynamics. Dynamics. Yeah.
Those rules working together to make systems.
Yes, dynamics are not written in the code. They're a lot of times not even in the rules, although some game designers like to put that in rule books just to let players know. But dynamics are just inherent to the fact there are multiple rules that work together to create experiences. And what's aesthetics? Yep.
Essentially all the things that give the player emotion.
Yes, it's a feeling that you get. So you do mechanic A, B, and C, and they come together in a dynamic, which is an experience that you have. And then how you feel about that experience that you had is the aesthetic. So yeah, just a quick, because this is very tied into MDA. So elegant games generally have a low mechanic to dynamic ratio. So maybe like games have a lot more than 3 mechanics, but say like in a simplified look, maybe 3 mechanics and then like 9 dynamics, right? 9 ways that those 3 mechanics work together. That is a very elegant game. That is something that is doing a lot with little. And generally speaking also, I didn't touch the A part so much, but if you have something that is like lots of different dynamics out of one mechanic, for it to feel elegant, you also kind of want to hone in on that one aesthetic that everything is kind of like revolving around. Yeah, so mechanics are the rules of your game. The dynamics are the ways in which the rules of the game interact, create meaningful experiences. And then, so yeah, looking at Mario, a jump is a mechanic. The fact that landing on an enemy makes the enemy die is another mechanic. So if you jump onto an enemy and kill it, that is a dynamic. That is a combination of those two things. So what was I going to say? Oh, yeah. I actually had, I like to bring in personal experience because I feel like that tends to help look at how these things are actually applied. For example, I'm working on a capstone game right now, and there is at least one person in this room who is in the same group with me on capstone. And we are making a tile-based tactical combat game. On its own, not very much an elegant thing, but we're working on it. We're cutting out things. So in the beginning, we wanted it to be very position-based and about like having the high ground or having better visibility than your opponent. And so we had things like changing terrain and fog of war, and the idea was that fog of war would be a dynamic thing that you can actually create and move and stuff like that. And then as we worked on the game, we found that the aesthetic that we were going for was more, we wanted it to be about saving the world, about the earth falling apart around you and you're trying to save it. And so that started informing our dynamics. We're like, okay, well, we want you to terraform the earth to fight enemies, but in doing so, you're kind of risking like the ground falling apart. And so suddenly we started focusing a lot on that. And then we still had that mechanic that we had at the beginning of the game that was the fog of war stuff. There was a bunch of mechanics relating to fog of war, and we realized the fog of war mechanics don't really mesh, or like they mesh, but like they don't really augment the terraforming mechanics. And they don't interact with those dynamics a lot, and they don't build into the aesthetic. And then Andrew actually said, can we just get rid of the fog of war? And I thought about it, and I was like, what is it doing there? Nothing. It's just there because we said it would. And so a lot of making a game elegant is being able to have that insight of like, does this augment what is already here? Is this one cohesive experience or something that is being attached on there just because we want it to be attached on there? And the answer generally is just cut it out. So moving on, here's why this mattered. And this is a big block of text, and you can read it later. I think I'm going to publish this somewhere. Don't worry about reading the whole thing now if you don't want to. But here's the big shtick. The more mechanics you have, the more rules your game has, the more of a mental load you're putting on your player. Let's think about it this way, like a complicated board game. You're reading that rule book. The more pages it has, the more shit you gotta memorize, and the more you're gonna forget everything and get frustrated and stop playing the game. Same applies for a video game. If you have a bunch of things that the player has to keep track of by themselves, are they gonna keep track of it? And what are they gonna feel when they fail track of it? Are they gonna feel good about it? No, they're gonna hate it. They're gonna be like, they're either gonna feel like the game sucks and start playing it, or they're gonna feel like they suck at the game and stop playing it. Bless you. And again, that's not to say that overly complicated games aren't fun. There is an audience for that, but there needs to be a reward for getting past that initial wall of information, right? So we'll get to that. But the less mechanics your game has, the more approachable it is. The easier it is for someone to look at it and pick it up. If you look at Mario, you know exactly what to do. You run, right, and jump. Done. You're good. Go play your game. Like, it's easy to pick up, right? This also applies, and this is a big deal, to your workload as a designer, as a programmer, as a team member, as an artist, or whatever. The more mechanics your game has, the more work you're gonna have to put in. If you play your cards right, you can make a lot of unique experiences with very little mechanics. And then instead of having like dozens, and God forbid hundreds of scripts on your program, you could get away with having like 10 or 12 and still make a game that produces meaningful experiences. And I would argue that if you're starting with when you're getting into game design, you should aim for that. You should aim for things you can do quickly and just iterate, because like I think what should happen is you're going to start with simple games, with bad simple games. And then you're going to progress into good simple games. And then eventually start tackling the really complex stuff that require a lot of systems, that require a lot of balancing. Because when you get to that point where you're doing like all this complicated stuff, you want to have experience. You want to know what you're doing, so it doesn't take for fucking ever. So the more elegant your game is, the easier it is for the player, the easier it is for you. And again, to tie back to earlier, humans just kind of like elegant things. We kind of like it's pleasing to our brains to see, there's not a lot actively going on here, but there is a lot going on here. That's interesting. But I want to touch on sophistication, because what happens a lot when people talk about elegance is people are like, what about Civilization? What about StarCraft? What about Warhammer? These are complex games. What about Dungeons and Dragons? People like those games. Yes. Elegance is not the end-all be-all of a game. This is something I'm pushing for, because I think it is a better place to learn design from. But also, I think this is still important for StarCraft, Civilization, Warhammer, stuff like that, to think about this, because while they do have a lot of complexity, they have the depth to back that up. So let's talk about depth and complexity, because those are not the same as elegance and sophistication. Ideally, a sophisticated game is also deep. If you look at depth as a potential dynamics offered by a game, So the concrete, like, the list of possible experiences you can have with a game, and a deep game will have a lot of those, right? Take Minecraft. Take
Chess.
huh? Chess is a deep game. I'm thinking Spelunky was the one that I was thinking of. There's a lot to unpack. There's a lot to uncover. There's a lot to discover that a lot of the times, if not most of the times, are things that weren't even designated by the designer, that it just happened because they created an interesting and robust set of mechanics that mesh together really, really well. And that's kind of what you want to go for, because the more depth your game has inherently, the more there is to do with less learning. Or maybe even more learning, but less learning up front, with less of a barrier to entry, less cost. Complexity is just a unique set of mechanics required to play the game. So things like Warhammer, things like Dungeons and Dragons, things like Civilization, StarCraft, they are all very complex games. Though that has a high barrier to entry. It's hard to start playing StarCraft. It took me forever to, like, I never even got okay at it. I'm still pretty bad, and I played it a lot. Maybe that's on me, but it's a high barrier of entry. That doesn't mean it's bad, because that's interesting too. Trying to master this complex system, people enjoy that. However, while elegant games trend towards depth and sophisticated games trend towards complexity, sophisticated games are still deep, right? Think about, like, who here has played Civilization? Okay, was any two games that you played ever the same? No, yes, there are tons of mechanics. There's a huge, like, a lot to do, but all those mechanics mesh. They all interact with each other for the most part. They interact, they create, each set of mechanics creates new dynamics with each other, and the set of things you can do grows exponentially. And that is interesting. All their mechanics are used in conjunction, they make combinations, and it just, like, more and more content, more and more things to do. And so you are you're paid back for the work up front that you put in by having a seemingly limitless set of experiences, of content that you can get from this game. That's why people sink thousands of hours into Civilization, is because you can. Yeah, so again, if you're going to ask someone to get into a complex game, make sure you have depth, you have that reward of more and more experiences to back up all the mechanics that people have to slog through. If you create a game that's complex and not deep, that is bad territory, because what that is a very shallow experience. There's a lot of learning, and then you start and you play a game, and, like, okay, and then you can play again if you want, which you probably will, because you're like, there has to be more to this, and then there isn't, and then you feel cheated, right? Who here has played No Man's Sky? Would you say that is a deep game?
I didn't play it very long.
Exactly. The feedback that people keep saying is, yeah, there's a lot to do, but all it tends to involve is go to a new place, look at similar looking things, drill different materials, and manage your inventory, and then leave. And then there's, like, the learning words mechanic. Does that add to the other stuff? Does learning words, like, does that have anything to do with the inventory management or the finding new species? Those mechanics don't interact with each other. They don't build off of each other. and that makes for a very complex experience. But is it deep, or were you left wanting? Feel free to disagree. A lot of people actually did like No Man's Sky, but just given the feedback that I've heard is that the general consensus tends to be is that people feel cheated, so much so that it became a bad thing for the people who made that game. So, high depth, high complexity, Warhammer, Civilization, those are sophisticated games. High depth, low complexity. That's your Mario's, your Portals. It's something that does a lot with very little. These are elegant games. This is what generally you should strive for. Let's talk about low depth, high complexity, that No Man's Sky. This, sadly, is where I would say maybe not the majority, at least not anymore, but a huge section of the games that are made both in this club and elsewhere tend to fall in this category because people don't think through it enough. They just like throw more mechanics and more mechanics. They're like, we need more content for our players. And generally speaking, when people think about adding more content, they see that as adding more physical things in the game. And that takes forever. That is more things for the player to learn. And then once they play that piece of content you threw in there, there's nothing more to it. Whereas if you look ahead and you're going for that high depth, right? Then when you throw in a new content, it's not something that the players can just like play and then they're done. It affects everything else, and then they're going back and forth and having all these new experiences. That probably sounded terrible for anyone who's like listening to this. I just hit the microphone. Whoops. Yeah. Low depth, low complexity. That sounds like it should be terrible, especially since I put Flappy Bird as the example. However, the reason low depth and low complexity games tend to be better than low depth, high complexity games is because while you're not getting a whole lot out of your game, at least it's easy to get into. Think about Doodle Jump. Think about getting over it. Oh, getting over it. I would say that's an elegant game.
Yeah. Really.
There's a lot of improvement you can have as a player. The more you play, you can get better at the game.
Have you seen speedruns of that game?
Yeah.
Crazy.
Kill me.
They're like 4 minutes long. You beat the whole game.
Yeah, I watched that. My God.
Right. Yeah. So, I would argue that that's kind of an elegant game because there is depth to it. There's learning that you can do. Yes.
Where would a game like Undertale fall under?
Undertale. Mechanic-wise, I would put it somewhere in the middle. But the game as a whole, holy shit, is that deep? That is a deep game. There are experiences where you literally will not have playing the game ever because there are lots of events that are scripted only for some people, and it's kind of random. You're given it like a seed of like what kind of random things will or will not happen. There's so much lore to discover. There's so many places that you can like find a way into that like most playthroughs will never like get to that place. I would say that's an elegant game. Within the battle game itself, there isn't that much complexity and there isn't that much depth either. I would say that is a fairly low depth, low complexity component of the game, but I would argue that the game as a whole is a very deep experience, and it doesn't take a lot to get into because you can just kind of like walk around and talk to people, and that's not really hard to do. So I would say elegant. Feel free to argue. Yes.
That game has a lot of like really simple mechanics.
Yes.
That kind of like I feel that because they're independent of each other, they're not like high depth, high complexity. It's not like a high depth, high complexity game like Civilization, where it's
Right.
like, it's a bunch of like mechanics, but they all like work in tandem to create something more like sophisticated.
Mhm.
It's like, you know, like each boss battle, for example,
Yes.
introduces a mechanic, and they're very simple. It's like it's either like a platformer or it's like kind of like a rhythm-esque game
Yeah.
type thing. Sometimes it's just like straight up bullet hell
Yeah.
style. So it's kind of like, I think it's the fact that you have so many unique experiences that are all like low complexity things.
Yeah.
And it kind of uses like the bigger picture to kind of like wrap it all together in a very nice package.
Yeah.
It's very interesting to do this.
I agree with that. And that was actually, I love that game. A lot of people hate it because of the community, which I personally don't think that is fair, but like fairness doesn't play into most things. But one complaint of Undertale that I saw that I was like, yeah, that is something that you can argue to me is that the combat like mini game essentially is like kind of weirdly separate from the rest of the game, and they don't play with each other, or like it's almost a separate game from the real game, which I kind of agree with that assessment because bullet hell and then like the story of Undertale, but they do a lot within that, like you said, like sometimes it's a bullet hell, sometimes it's almost a rhythm game, but like whatever it is, whatever's happening inside that box tends to be directly correlated to who you're fighting or what's happening. And also the whole mercy mechanic is a huge thing. So I would argue that while mechanically they don't always play into each other, there's a dynamic there for sure. I believe that there's a big dynamic happening between those two systems that aren't necessarily a mechanical dynamic as much as just a narrative dynamic, almost an experience. Yeah. I guess any other questions or comments? I like talking about this stuff. All right. That said, standalone mechanics are bad. So again, we want whatever. I said it somewhere. We want mechanics that build into multiple dynamics, which create a rich experience. So if you have a mechanic in there that is not playing into the rest of the game, that isn't augmenting the rest of the experience, if it's not playing into that core aesthetic of your game, why the hell is it there? Why? You're like, that's one more thing for the player to learn, and then they learn it, and they're like, okay, now it's gone, I guess? And it's more work for you for no reason, because it doesn't build into the game. This is, I talked to the design director before I did this, and he read through the slides, and he read this, and he calls this concept the Chekhov's gun of game design. Does anyone know what Chekhov's gun is? Yeah, it's, can someone tell me?
It was like, if it shows up at some point in a story, like narrative-wise, it's going to be relevant later.
Right.
Or at least it should.
Or at least, exactly, or at least it should. So Chekhov said that if, his example was, if in the beginning of, I think it was a play, he was talking about plays, there's a big gun on the mantle and it's like right there, then somewhere in the play that gun should be used. Because it's like here's a gun, just kidding, it's worth nothing, it's not there for a reason.
Why are we paying attention to this? Why are we spending time on this at all?
Exactly. Yeah, you want things that are there to do something. And that's kind of what the core of this goal of Elegance is to make sure that everything plays into your game, that everything is meaningful, that you create meaningful experiences for your players. And so a way to use these concepts, and this is something I take with me every time I want to design something. And I take the MDA, and I take MDA, and I take this, and whenever I'm making a game, I look at my core mechanic. And then I look at other mechanics, and I think to myself, do these two work together, right? You want to add things that will create combinations, right? You want the power of permutation on your side, to have these mechanics combine and create more content. This is actually another thing that happened when we were working on our capstone game is Kyle and I were working on an ability system, and we wanted ability. Basically, the way we architecture the system was that abilities had a target, which was a set of tiles in the world, and something that it did to those tiles. And so what we ended up doing is we created these objects at which each of them was a type of targeting, maybe a circle, maybe a line, maybe target a specific tile. So we created a group of those, and we created a group of core abilities, things that happen to the tiles. And we did those just to create 3 abilities. We were like, oh, we want an ability that does this thing to these tiles, an ability that does this thing to these tiles, this thing to this tile, these tiles. And we had 3 abilities. But the way we structured it is that any type of targeting can go into any ability. That was not something that was intended until afterwards. We're like, wait, we can mix and match these. And that was when I realized that when we thought we had made I think it was like 5 abilities total, we had actually made 20 abilities with like 5 scripts or 6 scripts or something like that. So that's something to think about when you're designing. You want to strive for that purposefully instead of accidentally stumbling on it like I did. You want to have that experience where the small things you did created a whole bunch of content, where like suddenly in a half hour there were 20 more abilities than there were before. You want that because that is a good feeling and it makes life easier on you. So Portal, you mentioned, was an elegant game, and so let's look at how that is elegant. And I think that looking at the mechanics and seeing them come together will help you have an idea of how this works. So let's look at some. Let's look at some mechanics of Portal. Let's say mechanic A is you can run. Mechanic B is you can shoot portals. Mechanic C is just physics. And mechanic D is that when something goes into one portal, it comes out the other. Right? Okay, so fairly simple. Those 4 things you can grasp right away. Of course, in the actual game, there are a whole lot more mechanics, but let's just look at all the dynamics that these 4 things can create. And turns out it doesn't fit in the screen. I can actually come up with a lot more. And I'm sorry, people. I hit the mic again. The last 4 was kind of a joke, but like, if you combine running and things that go into portals come out the other portal, then you can reach faraway places by going through portals. If you combine that with the ability to shoot portals, then you can use portals to get somewhere else, to shoot more portals to get somewhere else. If you combine that with physics, then something going quickly into a portal comes out quickly on the other side. So if you combine physics, the portal mechanic, and the ability to shoot portals, so then if you're falling, you can shoot downwards and you come out flying the other side of the portal. But then if you combine that with the ability to move, then you can get somewhere, jump down, shoot down, go through the portal, shoot something else and fly, and you're just flying around in this complicated mess of physics and portal puzzle solving, all with 4 mechanics. There's so much you can do with just those limited set of things. So I think that like literally writing down your mechanics and literally putting them together to see what happens if you put them together is a very useful thing. Because then you can see, because if you're making a game and you wrote down, say, 4 things, and the right side of the screen, and again, there's a lot more that I could fit in here, but say hypothetically, you ran out of things that combinations you can make at like 4, and there's like a 4-to-4 ratio, like 1 dynamic per mechanic, like then you have to take a step back and be like, okay, do these mechanics even work together? If the answer is no, then maybe tweak the mechanics or replace one entirely. And oftentimes, when you see those things side by side and you're like, this just isn't adding up, then you have to think, what are you going for? What is your aesthetic, right? Because then you can look at your aesthetic and be like, okay, well, this mechanic is shooting and this mechanic is hugging people. Those are separate aesthetics. Those do not build towards the same experience. You cannot have a dynamic between hugging and shooting people. Actually, yes, you can, and that might be interesting. I'll think about that some other time.
Could you interpret hugging as grappling?
You can. So is this like a brawler / shooter?
It's like a beat 'em up and you grab someone and you just...
Hostage taking?
Yeah.
Who knows? There's a lot you can do with design that is very fun and exciting. Other thing, think about like how much this side grows exponentially instead of linearly when you add weighted cubes, pressure plates, doors, lasers, stuff like that. Because every single one of those things build into these core 4 things, right? Any questions? Yes?
Isn't hugging and shooting just basically Undertale?
God, you're right though. Yeah, there's no mechanical dynamic there, but there's an emotional dynamic of like, should I hug this person? Should I shoot them and kill them dead? All good questions. Who knows? Yeah. I mean, that's kind of the core of the game, isn't it? That's actually something that I like to do when I'm trying to design a game, especially from scratch, is try to find dynamics between things. It's crazy the kinds of games you can make. My belief is that the best place for design is a constrained space where you have limits on what you can and cannot do, and so you're like, take what you have and see how can I put these things together in an interesting, meaningful way. The biggest project that taught me a big part of what I know as a designer is I wanted to make a collectible card game like Magic the Gathering or Yu-Gi-Oh! Or whatever, something like that, but without randomness. My goal was to make a card game where the cards are pre-sorted, and that brings up so many questions like, how are the games going to be different if it's the same cards every time? Like, where does the strategy come in? How does that affect the deck building? And so a lot of what the design process entailed is coming up with mechanics and trying to create as many dynamics as possible to make this thing as dynamic as possible, because I needed to make sure that it was different every time, that it was still an interesting game, even though you knew what card you were going to draw next. That was really fun. I would not say that I want to work on it again sometime. The result as it stands, I think it's fairly deep, but it's a little too complex. I think just things like that, taking things and trying to just even pick random things and try to combine them, see what you can create out of it, and then build your whole game around that. I think that is a very interesting design exercise. Yeah. Any questions or comments? Yeah.
What was like the title?
Oh, yeah. It was, what does it mean for a game to be elegant? Basically talking about how to make low input, high output kind of experiences. So easy to pick up, hard to master kind of thing. You want some, this is not always true for all games, but generally speaking, you want to have a lot to work with very little, because that is very engaging for people to be able to discover these experiences. Okay. Anything else? Okay. I was gonna do an exercise with everyone, but it's 3:46. I'm very good at rambling and tangents, so there isn't time for that. However, just in your free time, I know it sounds silly, but it's how I got where I got as a designer. I was the design director all of last year, and I guess the biggest thing that I learned is the way that you make good portfolios, and the way that you improve as a designer is just by trying and trying and trying new things. And so maybe look at this and try to challenge yourself to make an elegant game. Maybe pick just a random mechanic or two and see how can I build off of these. What can I create with this limited tool set? And even if you don't actually make a game out of it, if you just like have your notebook out and you're writing down mechanics, and then on another paper writing down all the ways they could combine, and trying to come up with like an aesthetic or something like that, trying to create an interesting experience, even if it's just in your mind, it goes a long way. If you're interested in design, you might just find that it's fun, and who knows, maybe you'll be doing one of these and suddenly be like, hold on, this is an actual good game though. What if I just made it? And then you'll make it and you'll be like, yay. So that's my little bit of advice. Yeah, please just try it out. It's a lot of people like it. Designers tend to like it. Yeah. I guess this is officially over.